A little while ago, I made this baby Cthulhu and Elora, the wizard girl who accidentally summoned him into her world. This is genuinely one of my most favorite sculptures I've ever made. It's so silly and cute and fun, and I've been thinking a lot about how to expand this world a bit more. What character could I make to build out this Elora and baby Cthulhu universe? And I've decided to give this story a villain, Nyarlathotep. Now, if you've never heard of Nyarlathotep before, he is another malevolent outer god in H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. But unlike Cthulhu, it seems there's less agreement on what Nyarlathotep looks like. Anyway, I was particularly inspired by this version from, I believe, Daniel Aviles. I wasn't able to verify the name of the artist, so if you happen to know if this was actually by someone else, please let me know in the comments. Anyway, I was mightily inspired by this painting to make a giant glowing tentacle monster sculpture, so to that end I've made this sketch out of, appropriately enough, monster clay, which I will be using as a guidepost for the build throughout the process. We'll get into all the backstory of my particular version of Nyarlathotep later on in this video, but for now I think that is enough preamble. This is going to be a very technical build after all, and we do need to get started. Like all my sculptures, we're going to start with a wire armature. A little more complicated than usual because there's the head tentacle, 3 arms, and a whole bunch of leg tentacles to worry about, but for now we just need to worry about the upper body. I wrap all these wires in some aluminum tape, followed by a thin layer of translucent cosclay. Get a very basic and thin form going, and then set it aside to break out some LED noodles. See, I want to make this sculpture glow, just like Daniel Aviles' version, so we're going to embed some lights into the sculpture. This is one of the main reasons why this build is more complicated than most, because unlike a normal sculpture where I can start by establishing the forms and the silhouette, I have to slowly build it up a few layers at a time, starting with the lights. Anyway, once I have the noodles all wired up and tested the circuit, I embed the noodles into more translucent clay and sculpted another layer on top. Again, keeping it very thin and basic, baked it and tested it again. This glowing thingy is going to form the core of my sculpture, so I need to get it working right away and retest it throughout the process. But now that we have established that the core electronics work, we can actually start sculpting this piece. I am making the entire torso, including the head, out of translucent cosclay because I want to control the amount of glow with paint later on. The unfortunate thing about translucent cosclay is that it is very annoying to sculpt with. It is very soft and very low contrast, which makes it hard to see what's going on with the shapes. I'm sure if I used it all the time I would get better at it, but being that this is my first time using it in any serious way, it was pretty tough. Thankfully, this kind of sculpting isn't terribly precise. I'm going for a sinewy, half-muscle, half-stretchy, wrinkly monster skin, which is a lot easier than sculpting, say, people. So as long as I stay patient, it's not too bad. I'm building up a sort of high collar around the neck, which might seem strange for a seemingly naked organic creature, but I'm actually going for a Hellraiser sort of vibe in the finished piece, so think Pinhead and other similar characters. I know it's a little hard to imagine right now, but you'll see when the paint goes on. There are only spikes on half the collar because I want the design to be generally unsymmetrical. He's already got 3 arms, so I want to really lean into the dissymmetry of the piece. There's a bit more to this unsymmetrical idea, but I'll get into it when we work on the arms and hands. It'll be easier to explain that way. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I also sculpted his face, which I kept fairly basic and skull-like because I think there's already so much going on with the teeth and the lights and whatnot, and I think the humanoid structure makes it a bit more unsettling. Once I am done with the torso, I can start in with the arms. These are made using a 2-to-1 mix of Super Sculpey and cosclay. I find the extra added cosclay makes the mixture a little bit stickier and a little bit easier to work with. I mention this only because people occasionally ask what kind of clay I use, and it's kind of an odd mixture. But you should know that I change up the clay that I use all the time. Sometimes it's just straight up Super Sculpey, sometimes it's just cosclay, clay, sometimes it's just some other brand or type entirely, like with the sketch using monster clay. It just depends on the specific thing I'm doing. Anyway, I'm using this stuff for the arms because it's a lot easier to sculpt with compared to the translucent stuff, and the limbs won't need to emit light at all. Unlike the body, I'm making the arms more armored and less sinewy and muscly. I'm still generally following the same stretchy motifs and the gaps between the sections, but it felt right for the non-glowy parts to be more structured. As I said earlier, I want to lean into the unsymmetrical design on this piece, and I'm going to keep pushing on that idea by making all three arms completely different from each other in terms of how muscular they are and in the placement of individual armor plates. I'm hoping that all this dissymmetry will help the character feel more disjointed and unsettling, like this physical form is not a big enough vessel to hold Nyarlathotep's immense power in a cohesive shape. Secretly, the unsymmetrical design also makes it more fun and easier to sculpt in the sense that I don't have to worry about symmetry at all. I'll let you decide which is the real reason. And once the arms are in good shape, we can move on to the hands. I don't usually do hand armatures because I find them a little restrictive, but I'm going with a fairly complicated one this time because all of the fingers are going to be splayed out and pointing every which way, and I didn't want to deal with broken fingers when I'm painting the model later. This green stuff is green stuff epoxy putty. It is very, very useful for small things like this because it is very sticky and durable once cured. You're going to see this in a second, but the fingers and hands will be the most obviously armored part of the design. Continuing the idea that the arms are more armored than the torso, it gets even more obviously armored in the hands. Of course, this doesn't make any sense as functional armor design goes, but it's a weird magical tentacle monster. It doesn't have to make total sense as far as I'm concerned. Unlike the arms, I'm only doing two designs for the three hands, one sleeker, more delicate design for the twin arm side, and a spikier, more beefy design for the muscular arm side. What I'm hoping to achieve is that this will help the unsymmetrical design feel a little bit more cohesive, and that there are two versions of Nyarlathotep occupying the same body, a scrawny, multi-armed monster on the right, and a more humanoid version on the left. I'm trying to add a little bit of cohesion back into the potentially mishmash design so that it doesn't feel like just a random mix-up of ideas. Of course, whether that's successful is up to you to decide, and you're about to be able to do that because here are the three hands all done, and it is time to attach them to the arms. First, I cut down the excess clay from both the stump and the hand to make room for the attachment. If you're wondering why I bothered sculpting the parts that are going to be cut off, it's because I never know exactly where it's going to be cut off, especially in a design like this, so a little over-sculpting is actually useful here. The attachment is done with Odie's Fix-It Stick, plumber's epoxy. It's an epoxy putty that cures very hard in about 10 minutes, so it's great for this kind of fast operation where you need to attach something quickly and strongly. And once the hand is on, I can sculpt over the epoxy with more polymer clay. The twin arms on the right are pretty straightforward and simple, but for the more muscular left arm, I'm going to add a bunch of spikes to form a sort of facsimile of a noble's ruffled sleeve cuff. This is actually what I was going for with the spikes on the collar as well. It's just a little easier to explain when you see it all together like this. Again, we'll get into his backstory a bit later, but for now I can tell you that even in his revealed monster form, Nyarlathotep still wants to look fancy. In my version, Nyarlathotep is an arrogant, self-important outer god who likes a little noble affectation in his appearance. In fact, even his leg tentacles, which we will eventually get to, is meant to evoke something like the skirt of a noble's robes. Okay, with the hands attached, here is what we have so far. But before we can make more progress, we have to go back and make some adjustments. He's just too thin right now, and we have to bulk him up a little bit. Not that much, but just enough that he's not looking so scrawny. Anyway, it's a lot of little changes, so I'll spare you the excruciating details, but after I add a whole bunch of clay all over and subtract a little bit here and there, it goes from this to this. Can you tell the difference? I showed it to someone in real life and they could not, so that made me feel great. To be fair, it's not a huge difference in terms of clay volume, but for me, it's a big difference in overall feel, and most importantly, I'm much happier with this version than before. Anyway, that's done with. Now it's time to add these back tentacles over here. First, I'm going to mark out the positions where they need to go, drill some holes, and rough in their positions using aluminum wires and an initial layer of clay. I bake these initial layers so that more clay can have something to grab onto, then get to bulking them up to be closer to their intended size. Baking on an initial layer helps make sculpting small shapes like this easier, but more importantly, I need to get an idea of what's going on with the shapes and positions before committing. Otherwise, we might run into compositional or proportional issues like we did with the torso. Once I'm satisfied with the positions, I can sketch in the beginnings of a tentacle's design, then remove the tentacle to work on it individually. I went with a stretchy, fleshy design on these because that's also what I plan to do for the leg tentacles, and I want them to be made the same way for visual cohesiveness. Now, I could show you how I painstakingly sculpted the wrinkles on each of the 10 tentacles on his back, how each one was designed to break the torso silhouette in a specific way, and maybe even a lore tidbit about how Nyarlathotep decided to sprout them to look more fancy and intimidating. But be honest, could you even tell that I just showed you process shots for 3 different tentacles just now? Even I have a hard time telling them apart, so let's just fast forward to the end and I can show you how they all ended up looking on his back. I did bundle some of them together with epoxy clay to make them easier to handle during painting, and of course kept them removable for the same reason. But that's the back tentacles, and we can now move on to the head and finish off the upper body. First, I put the head tentacle armature wire back where it's supposed to be, then bulk it out just a little bit with aluminum tape and went to town with some clay. I first tried to sculpt the tentacle out of translucent clay like the face because I thought it would be easier to see the shapes if it was all the same material. But then I quickly remembered that raw translucent clay looks nothing like baked translucent clay, and I'm making this harder on myself for no reason, so I switched back to the same gray that I used for the arms. I'm making this particular tentacle smooth and, shall we say, dolphin-like, because I think it's weirder and creepier this way. Also, the illustration that inspired this had the same thing and I thought it was cool. I even added some slight wrinkle work on the main bend just to sell the effect further. I really like how this looks. It's a wonderful contrast to the heavily textured body, and it's extra gross in just the right way. But that is going to be it for the head and the entire upper body, which means we can finally move on to the most intimidating and unfortunately tedious part of this whole piece, the lower body tentacles. And just a reminder, we're trying to get it to look something like this, but with some texturing on it so it doesn't look like a 6-year-old did it. So first we gotta extend the LED wiring to give ourselves enough material to work with and retest the circuit again just to make sure I didn't break anything while doing that. It would be a shame if we did all this work only for the light to burn out at this stage. The leg armatures need to be extended too, of course. I built a 4-legged armature to begin with, but this guy has 8 legs, 4 long ones and 4 short ones. I knew I was going to have to extend it eventually, and now is the time. Thankfully, this part of the process went basically as planned, and I am now ready to apply some clay. But I can't use polymer clay like I did with the body because this thing is just too damn big. I mean, look at this thing. This is just the upper body before the leg extensions, and even though it might be funny if he had short cuttlefish tentacles, I don't think that's the best thing to do for this piece. So I'm gonna have to use something else. Epoxy clay. Epoxy clay is a 2-part compound that has a work time of about 2 to 3 hours and fully cures into a hard, durable substance in 24 hours. It's great for fangs, claws, weapons, anything that needs to be thin and strong, but it's also terrible for normal sculpting. It's saggy, weirdly squishy, it's a skin irritant so you have to wear gloves, and it's toxic so if you sand it you have to wear breathing and eye protection. It's terrible, But the worst part is that sculpting 8 more tentacles is ridiculously tedious and boring to watch. So instead of putting you through all that, I'm going to speedrun this section and get us through to the next step as soon as I can. So here we go. So far, we've roughed out the tentacles to figure out their positions and give them some mass. Next, I'll redo the wire extension with heat shrink solder because I did a bad job soldering the wires and the joints were too big to hide underneath the clay. Build up the surface with more clay and add some wrinkly textures. This white stuff is the same as the green-gray stuff, just a different color. This took a very long time and it looked nothing like the back tentacles that I wanted them to look like, so that's great. But we'll ignore that for now and grind down some of the oversculpting from the space between the sub-tentacles to make room for the stretchies. You'll see what I mean in a second, because the next step is to fill in those areas with stretchy parts to make the tentacles look nice and gross, including the waist area to blend the upper and lower body together. Next, we add some edge definition around some of the sub-tentacles so it's not just a gooey mess of textures. When I say sub-tentacles, I mean the smaller tentacles that make up the big ones. Each of the big tentacles have 2 to 3 sub-tentacles that help give each of them some dimension and keep them from being just a bunch of wrinkly tubes. Instead, it's a bunch of smaller wrinkly tubes stuck together. Then I decide that no, I don't like how wrinkly these tentacles are, and I spend hours grinding down the textures that I spent hours putting in. And while I'm at it, grind down the stretchies between the sub-tentacles too, because I didn't think they sank in deep enough and didn't have enough contrast. Then sand down the grounded textures because dremeling with diamond bits leave a bunch of unsightly sharp edges behind, and bada bing, bada boom, nearly 100 hours and over 40 sessions later. It is done-ish. There's one last step, but we'll get to that before painting. Because right now we have to switch gears to work on the base. See, we need to fit this complicated light-up tentacle monster to a complicated light-up base, and we gotta do the base before painting this time around in case we need to make some adjustments to the model. I've glued together 2 pieces of 3/4 inch MDF and now I'm going to route some circles out of it along with 2 pieces of polycarbonate that I unfortunately don't have the footage for because the card got corrupted. Just imagine this, but with a sheet of polycarbonate instead, resulting in this. And this is the MDF frame that we were cutting out earlier. The idea is to fill the inside of this frame with LED lighting that will shine through the top lid where the terrain and the model will sit. If what I'm saying doesn't make any sense, it's okay, it will be clear in just a few minutes. But now that we have the parts, I'm going to first epoxy the bottom lid right onto the MDF frame. There's no need to access this from the bottom, so I can simplify my life a little bit by making this permanent. Next, I'll drill out some holes for a switch and power jack that you'll see later. Then I'm going to line the insides of this thing with aluminum tape because I want as much of the light inside this base to bounce up through to the top as possible, and a shiny metallic surface is going to be better at doing that. After the tape is down, we spray the frame black, and yes, I should have sprayed the frame black before I applied the tape. Anyway, after the spray, we can install the LED strip that's going to be lighting up the base from the inside. This is just some no-name light strip from Amazon, nothing particularly special about them. It took me a couple of tries to figure out the right arrangement of the strip so I can make use of the entire length, but I eventually got it figured out. I gave it a quick test, then wire up the splitter and the switch. I'm going to use the AC adapter that came with the light strip to power both the model and the base with this splitter. On one end, the splitter goes to the light strip, the other goes to the voltage controller that's going to turn down the 24 volts from the power adapter to the 3 volts that's needed by the model. The power switch is installed before the split so that one switch can turn both components on at the same time. One last test to make sure the controller works, and we are good with the bottom of the base. The little thing that I'm holding there is a mock-up that I made to test how the LED noodles work inside translucent clay. Everything works, so hooray! We can move on to the top lid and terrain itself. First, I mix up some perfect cast and aquarium sand and gravel to create a sort of goop to build the actual diorama base with. Once it's all solidified, I take the world's worst pizza and literally break it apart. The idea is that I want to create a broken up ground with glowing lava effect coming from underneath to go with the glow coming from Nyarlathotep's body. And instead of figuring out how to create realistic broken ground texture, I figured I'd go ahead and break it for real. This was not as successful as I'd hoped. The pieces broke into bigger and squarier chunks than I wanted, but at this point I didn't have another option and I still didn't think I could do better by hand sculpting the whole thing, so I went with it. I put the pieces back together the best way I knew how, gave them some gaps, and ground the pieces to fit the polycarbonate lid with some diamond bits that were definitely useless after this task. From there, we applied some good old terrain paste. It's actually arguable whether I was better off leaving the perfect cast as is, but there were spots on the perfect cast that was too smooth, so I figured I had to do something to it. From there, it's black paint, a few layers of dry brushing, and some washes to give it some variation and dimension, and I can hot glue everything down and we're finally ready to fit the model to the base. I figured out a position that makes the most sense and marked those spots, then grind those spots down to make some room. Fill the gap with some Sculptamold, place the model on, and we have a perfect fit. The idea is that the model needs to sink slightly into the ground, otherwise the rough texture of the terrain paste is going to make him look like he's hovering a couple of millimeters above the base. Anyway, once the Sculptamold is dry, we can do the same terrain paste routine on top of the patches, and that is it for the base. Is what I would have said if we didn't need to do something about the polycarbonate in between the ground pieces. I actually was kind of hoping to get away with using just the lighting from underneath to color the plastic, but after some testing, the light that I got just wasn't orange enough, so I had to tint it with a mixture of gloss Mod Podge and some red and yellow ink. Yes, I should have tested it beforehand, but I didn't, and this is what we have to do to fix it. But with that, the base is done, and we can finally get to painting the model. Is what I would have said if we didn't need to do one last thing to fix up the sculpt. Do you remember the sanding and grinding that we did on the tentacles? Well, it left a lot of deep grooves and sharp edges that couldn't really be easily sanded, so I'm first going to spray down all the non-glowy parts with some lacquer filler, in this case Mr. Hobby Surfacer 500. This is the tool that I reach for when I need to do some last-ditch fixes, and for whatever reason, more sculpting isn't an option. And it really helped to fill in some of the sanding marks in this case. I wouldn't use it on everything because you don't want to just indiscriminately soften your piece like that, but it's a good tool to have in your back pocket. Anyway, now we can paint. And do you remember I promised you I was going to tell you the backstory to this character? Well, thankfully, the paintwork is blissfully simple, so I'm just gonna leave a note here in the corner to let you know what I'm doing, and I can instead talk about the more important thing. Who is Nyarlathotep, and what does he have to do with Elora and baby Cthulhu? In my particular version, Nyarlathotep is the son of Azathoth, ruler of the dungeon dimension and the chaos realm, and father of all interdimensional tentacle monsters, which makes Nyarlathotep a prince, and also Cthulhu's great-great-uncle. Nyarlathotep is, let's be very frank, an outright evil and malevolent entity. He spends his time walking the earth in the guise of a man, spreading chaos and nightmares everywhere he goes. He especially enjoys starting death cults revolving around hideous nightmares of his own creation. Why does he do this? Well, when you're a 10,000-year-old prince of the Chaos Realm, you get a little bored and entitled. He views humanity as an interesting curiosity, in the same way that some people are curious about how puppies would react if you kick them. Yeah, he is not a good guy. Anyway, Nyarlathotep never liked his great-great-nephew Cthulhu very much. He thinks Cthulhu is lazy, sleeps all the time, and doesn't do enough to spread the power and influence of the outer gods and whatnot. And when news of Cthulhu's new form reached Nyarlathotep, he took personal umbrage. He was offended on behalf of all interdimensional tentacle monsters. How dare this wizard girl entrap his good-for-nothing nephew in this ridiculous and cute form? So he decides to do something about it. But Nyarlathotep, being the helpful and lovable guy that he is, doesn't just show up and say, "Hey, Elora and Cthulhu, here's how you send my nephew back to the dungeon dimension." No, he shows up and berates them for not having done it themselves, and how dare they expect him to help? Cthulhu should be self-sufficient and help himself, damn it! And instead of helping, he sicks his nightmare death cult on Elora and Cthulhu with the goal of sending the both of them to the dungeon dimension for extended torture and punishment. But unbeknownst to this cantankerous asshole, Cthulhu has actually been rather enjoying his time experiencing the world as this admittedly lesser but more fun version of himself. Cthulhu, as it turns out, kinda likes hanging out with Elora and experiencing just 3 dimensions, and has come to think of her as a friend. So Cthulhu decides, at least partially because it would enrage Nyarlathotep, to take her side. Cthulhu confronts Nyarlathotep and demands his uncle leaves Elora and himself alone. And this, in fact, absolutely enrages Nyarlathotep, who abandons his human disguise and reveals his true form, exploding with power. And this is what this sculpture captures. The moment Nyarlathotep reveals his squid monster form, about to do battle with his great-great-nephew Cthulhu. An epic battle ensues, and oh no, whatever will Elora and baby Cthulhu do? How will they escape the immense power of this outer god prince? Find out next time on the adventures of Elora and baby Cthulhu. So that's how it is, and that's Nyarlathotep all painted up too. Which means it is time for final assembly. I drill a hole through the top right between 2 of the rocks, run the wire through, place Nyarlathotep in his spot, and install the connector for the light. Bring in the base frame, connect up the wires, and place the lid along with Nyarlathotep on top. Finally, we install the back tentacles, and when I plug this whole thing in and turn it on, it looks a little something like this. And that is it for this monster of a project. See what I did there? I hope you found this video interesting, or at least diverting. I am very happy with how this thing turned out. It makes a wonderful companion piece to Elora and baby Cthulhu. I especially love how Nyarlathotep's face appears to be cracking with overflowing power from the insides. This is actually because the airbrush didn't fill in all the little nooks and crannies in the sculpt, but it looks great, so we'll file this under happy accident. It's also ridiculously huge. In fact, it's a little over 2 feet or 60 centimeters wide at its widest point, so I will have to figure out how to store and display this thing, but that is a future me problem. Thank you to all my beautiful and handsome patrons for supporting this show. Welcome to new members Kikuler, Marco Eli Galindo Munoz, Alex L, Insomniac Digital, Julio Rosas, Tanbark, and a very special thanks to Tom WDW for being a patron of the Arts tier supporter. If you enjoy what I do and want to also support my work, or if you want to learn how to sculpt in my style, please consider checking out patreon.com/artchongart, where I have a whole bunch of tutorials showing you how to do exactly that. In any case, thank you for watching all the way to the very end. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.